So first, I want to extend my gratitude. I usually am sitting where you are, looking at lectures, really growing up in Washington, D.C., and coming back here teaching at Howard, so it really is a sheer honor. Thank you so much to the organizers of this symposium, to my Howard University colleagues, and also to my father and my stepmother who are here in the crowd, and my neighbor as well, so really brought the community out. So I'm actually going to give you a visual overview of, so we're going to look at a lot of pictures of DC's religious landscape. So for over 7 years, I've been studying the visual culture of Black religion, specifically the iconographies or visual motifs that have been employed broadly to define Black religion. This 1950s Ebony magazine photo editorial featuring Gordon Parks' photograph of a Washington, D.C. spiritualist congregation is an instructive artifact that represents how the circulation of African-American photography records a range of ideological and social positions in American popular culture. This 1942 photograph is only one view from a series of images captured during Parks' singular visit to Verbeke Spiritual Church, the home of Ella Watson, one of Gordon Parks' signature subjects. Within the series of photographs, one of which you see here on the right, Parks stretches the design framework of Farm State Administration, or FSA, documentary photography of the 1930s to visualize the powerful scenes of religious spaces that were open and welcoming to the waves of new urban arrivals participating in the Great Migration. The theme of this year's symposium, Artists and Community, led me to consider the social context that Parks entered as an African-American photographer in a city with a rich photographic tradition among sectors of their Black religious landscape, going back to the 1890s. How did Parks view the DC religious landscape in relation to the aesthetic developed by local African-American photographers Addison Scurlock and his sons Robert and George Scurlock? A comparative analysis of the photographic practices of and among African-American communities in Washington, D.C. during the 1930s and 40s revealed that D.C. was a sphere of influence in the Black sacred cosmos that expanded and really boomed during the first half of the 20th century. Religious studies scholars C. Eric Lincoln and Lawrence Mamiya define the Black sacred cosmos as representing the range of religious expressions across the African diaspora. This concept of the Black sacred cosmos counters the notion of a singular monolithic African-American church and also redirects emphasis on the cyclical rise and fall that secular theory pushes versus a more comprehensive understanding of Black religion as regenerative and evolutionary. Gordon Parks' photographs that ask, are Negroes losing religion, really does provide just one view of a more extensive network of religious practice. The examination of Parks and Scurlock's revealed DC was committed to representing themselves in their religious life. Parks and Scurlock represent two varying perspectives and roles in the African-American community. Scurlock representing commercial photography with an aesthetic reputation, and Parks, a cultural insider but geographic outsider, experimenting with the visual strategies of documentary photography. So following a brief historical overview, this presentation will analyze how the African Methodist Episcopal denomination on the local level here in DC, as well as the national level, visually represented themselves. Where did these images circulate? I will then move to consider how Gordon Parks represented Washington, D.C. This is photographic evidence of him testing his adaptability skills with his own migratory experience. How does Parks access this religious landscape as an outsider? The same set of questions can be posed in the case of most African American religious communities and cultural institutions, such as Prince Hall Mason lodges and historically Black colleges and universities. So this presentation aims to contribute to art histories that trace African American ideologies of self-definition, or as art historian Amy Mooney recently puts it, an uplift ideology where Black identity is seen as a diverse intersection, a paradigm, and a way of life. The critical tone of this presentation is informed by Curtis Evans' The Burden of Black Religion, and his interest in modernism's, quote, claims about innate religiosity, discussions about the role of the Negro church, and cultural images of Black religion, end quote. According to Evans, Black religion as a visual motif produced during the first half of the 20th century were central to public debates and academic conclusions about the supposed inferiority of African Americans. At the foundation of my comparison is the groundbreaking scholarship of Colleen McDonnell in her 2004 book, Picturing Faith, Photography in the Great Depression. She does some very important things. First, she outlines that FSA and Office of War Information, or OWI photography, was informed by New Deal ideology, which had to make an argument for social services. Also, she focuses singularly on government photographs, and I think by looking at photographs produced across several sections in one site, we see the Black religious cosmos. Visual scholars such as Deborah Willis, Maurice Berger, Sean Michelle Smith, and more recently Emily Boone have continue to attentively recover how African Americans have used photography to advance ideologies ranging from Black Victorianism to 20th century democratic sensibilities. In her 2016 study of the relationship between race and religion, Judith Weisenfeld argues that in the context of the Great Migration, new religio-racial identities were introduced outside the realm of mainstream Protestantism. So as the oldest African-American religious denomination, the AME Church, approached 100 years, new religious communities contributed to a tradition, and here I cite Weisenfeld, a tradition in constructing, revising, or rejecting racial categories and thereby producing frameworks for religio-racial identities. What visual histories document the range of religio-racial identities of the Black sacred cosmos? So Black religious institutions are one of the earliest autonomous cultural spaces for African Americans and really are responsible for some of the earliest collective efforts to combat racist misrepresentations like this. Images like Svenen's Negro Methodist Church were popular throughout the 19th century and provided a visual complement to racist theology, philosophy, and later sociology. These images bolstered racist perspectives that legitimized Black emotionalism as a defining aspect of Black religious expression. With studies like the 1903 Negro Church by W.B. Du Bois, Du Bois's study of the particular units of Black religion initiated a discourse that would then be contributed to by Carter G. Woodson, The History of the Negro Church. And you can even see some subtle paradigms of the Africanized African presented here in visual terms. Zora Neale Hurston contributes with characteristics of Negro expression, also the Sanctified Church in the 40s, and also Arthur Fawcett's Black Gods of the Metropolis. The history behind picturing African American religious spaces and religious services can be traced to evidentiary uses in photographing slave churches on plantations. From the sociological gaze to documentary photography, there seems to be an insistence on photographing plantation religious spaces, but not the brush, not the sanctuary of the slave religion, as Albert Raboteau defines it. The brush is a sacred site that evades visual documentation. And I think this point can't be emphasized enough when we think about the revealing that documentary photography does. And so now I would begin to introduce you to the landscape that Parks enters. So as early as the late 19th century, Washington, D.C. has an established photographic scene. Here I'm showing you an advertisement for Daniel Freeman, who thus far is D.C.'s first African-American practicing photographer. But I also want to emphasize the networks of practice and collection that were happening. And here I'm showing you two AME bishops and their portraits that they had taken late 19th century. This portrait is in the collection of the Moreland Spingarn, and here we have an example of Bishop Daniel Payne, president of Wilberforce University, being photographed by white photographer C.M. Bell. So it's important to know that African Americans were using all sectors of the photographic landscape at the time. It should also be noted two aspects here. So on one side, thinking about the photographs that were collected by AMEs during this time, architectural photographs like this image that's in the collection of Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, but also these little known and little studied commissioned portraits, such as this historical portrait showing Bishop McNeil Turner welcoming an Ethiopian religious clergy. So where did these images circulate? In outlets such as the Encyclopedia of African Methodism, which is really an exhaustive, illustrated encyclopedia that was edited by Richard Wright, the sociologist, and really documents AME communities across the nation. And this brings us to the local legacy of AME churches in Washington, D.C. Here I'm showing you a photograph by Addison Scurlock of Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the Afro-British composer who led a chorale society briefly here in Washington, D.C. And this was their recital taken in Metropolitan AME Church, the oldest African Methodist Episcopal congregation in the city. So again, the same year that Addison Scurlock opens his studio, this photograph is taken. So religious communities are at the beginning of his practice. But it's just not metropolitan, and they're more sophisticated cultural expressions, right? Here with this recreation of an English coronation, but also for churches in Southeast, like Allen Chapel AME Church, which literally is still in this same building that is represented here. Scurlock also photographed every living AME bishop during his time, and these images would be placed on the wall in administrative buildings alongside their employees. And again, this links the AME Church to a history of photographing communities that we see with James Vanderzee's Abyssinian Baptist Church photographs, as well as this guild of nurses that wanted to document their time at Frederick Douglass's home. So there was kind of a wide-ranging network and aesthetic that I would like to trace across this institutional group photography. Also thinking about the other types of photographs that Scurlock produced during this period, he did these theatrical photographs of Howard University students that again were recreated and republished in the Hilltop magazine. And again, these are Howard University students as models. They created the backdrops as well, and then Scurlock would come in and actually photograph the scenes. And these theatrical productions were done between 1938 and 1940. And then here, just to show you, it just wasn't the more traditional African Methodist Episcopal Church, but also what we would identify as new religious communities, such as the United House of Prayer for All People, led by Daddy Grace. And generally, he's represented in these outdoor baptisms, but when you look deeper into the archive, we see that he's who wants to document the events of his church and also his administrative spaces. So I've increasingly been thinking about the impact of Du Bois's aesthetic description of religious frenzy and the impact that that could have had on picturing religious expression during the early 20th century. While Du Bois's ability to analyze Black religious institutions across sociological works such as the Negro Church have been acknowledged, Perhaps more people read Of the Faith of Our Fathers, included in the 1903 text, Souls of Black Folk. Du Bois scholar Barbara Savage and Curtis Evans consider how Du Bois's New England middle-class background and Victorian sensibilities could have impacted his description of religious practice. And I'll give you just a brief overview. He says, I was a country school teacher then, fresh from the East, and had never seen the Negro Southern revival. And he describes this revival as a Pythian mass, a demonic possession that lent terrible reality to song and word. He described them as scenes that appear grotesque and funny, but as seen, they are awful. This is really how he described his experience in the Southern church. And so I thought about how reading that could have perhaps influenced Archibald Motley's Holy Rollers, or even Prentice Taylor's Macedonia AME Church. And thinking about how does Gordon Parks represent the movement of the Black body in religious space. And we see him doing a lot of after image, or really this image here, the little after production to enhance, again, that spiritual aspect of the experience. And that's something that really stands out. And here, just to think about his experience viewing this religious community, spiritual community, as an outsider, comparing it to Doris Ullman's photographs reproduced in Roll Jordan Roll, there is a closer proximity. And it's interesting to think about his upbringing as a Methodist, and here a photograph of him before an AME church included in the new catalog, and how this may have framed his approach to photographing Ella Watson's church, that interest in the dark, deep space, but revealing in light the material and expressive affects of this flower ritual that he photographs. But what stands out to me is the difference that we see in the photographs once we get to the Church of God in Christ photographs. Here, from my documentation, he has no formal person to introduce him to this congregation. So there's more distance in the photographs that we see. And even the kind of posture of resistance that we find in these two women, one of which on the left in the deacon's corner, that I think reflect a kind of development of photography in the Church of God of Christ community during this period. The founder of the Church of God in Christ, C.H. Mason, Bishop C.H. Mason, is known in religious lore to be resistant to photography. He actually was instructed Ernest Withers on several occasions not to photograph him. There was R. William Earl, who was the official Kojic portraitist, who would take his image. But after he dies, it seems as though his congregation changes how they use photography. And so that could be why we see variation across his images of Kojic churches. And again, the Kojic community then decides to visualize the body as evidence of their founder, and also represent their new international headquarters as not a traditional church, but more of an industrial space, also acknowledging the role of women through photography. And this is very important because this is a time where the church is developing into the civil rights unit that we know. And so this is a photograph, again, of Martin Luther King in the headquarters of Church of God in Christ in Memphis, Tennessee. Not photographs of by Ernest Withers, noted. And so where did Gordon Parks' work circulate? And I don't have to spend a lot of time on it. I started with the example of the Black media, and also in government publications as well. Also, in this flash photography, technical publication, we get the images as well. So I was thinking about, I did say a comparison. What do these images share together? We see this interest, right, in altering this sense of value, and also the effects that are added after the photograph is taken to enhance the spirituality. Thinking about Vanderzee, Scurlock, Gordon Parks. So what does this mean? All of this is very important because I think representing the church during the mid-20th century is an important period that reminds the African-American churches across the nation of the importance of their representation. And Martin Luther King's representation really does facilitate the development of the Black churches into Black liberation entities that we see not only with Black Christianity, but also with Islam as well. And this becomes becomes important because by the 60s, again, there's this cultural revolution on how we interpret Black representation, but then postmodernism happens. And we begin to see more visibly the Black church entering popular culture. Here I'm showing you a television show that was enjoyed by the American public during the late 80s that again brought the African American Protestant church into popular culture. But this is also during the same time that African American artists are pushing the boundaries of representing African American art with Houston Conwell's Easter Shout, with Marilyn Nance's photographs of religious spaces, and also recent photographs by Michael Harris, Deborah Willis, all really show the impact and maybe the intervention of Gordon Parks. Okay. Thank you.